I want to welcome everybody to a look into the future. Before we get started, I would like to ask everybody to remain muted and turn off your camera, please, until the end. We will also have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll do a few pauses. So if you have any questions, be sure to drop in the chat box. I'm also going to drop a link for everybody. You will be able to access the slides and the evaluation at the end. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Darcy Johnson from Emporia State University and Deja Holmes from Johnson County Community College, and they'll be presenting a look into the future.
All right, thanks, Juliana. I will get the presentation pulled up here now. My name is Darcy. I'm the student loan coordinator here at Emporia State, and I have been in financial aid for just over 10 years now. And I'm glad that Daisha and I have the opportunity to share some very important information with you. Daisha, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Yes, I sure can. Okay, cool. I see the thing, so I know y'all can hear me. Hello, my name is Daisha Holmes. I am a financial aid coordinator here at Johnson County Community College. I help coordinate the infamous Kansas Promise program. That's kind of my jam. That's my little area. I've been in financial aid for only not even a year yet, but you know, I'm learning. I'm on my way. And before I was in financial aid, I was on the kind of the high school side as a college advisor with the Missouri College Advising Corps. So I know a little something, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you. And welcome to all the counselors, and happy, I believe I have this right, happy National Counselors Week. So we appreciate all that you do for your students. And so today we will be talking about how to prepare students for next year, the Kansas Promise Act, and then some FAFSA simplification. In keeping with the Outreach Training Committee's 80s movies theme this year, our theme is Back to the Future. So we're actually going forward to the future. And we're going to start out by talking about the roads, the paths that the students should be going down right now. And a lot of what we're talking about in this first section is under the assumption that your student has already filled out the FAFSA and had it submitted. But remember, it's not too late for them to fill out the FAFSA. There is an April 1st deadline of the FAFSA being completed for the state financial aid programs. And so you want to make sure that they're aware of that. But that is not an actual FAFSA deadline, that it cannot be completed after that. So there's a lot of misconception that, you know, if they don't fill it out in October, or they don't have it filled out by April 1st, then it's too late. It is not. They could still fill it out at any time. But we're going to talk about checking the student aid report and to make sure that it's not rejected and what that means, how to update the school selection, contacting the school or schools that they're considering attending, scholarships, evaluating financial aid offers, identifying the requirements that they may need to be thinking of for each type of aid that they're receiving, and then some final steps that they need to do. So the student aid report, or SAR, is when the student submits their FAFSA. All of that data is used and put into this output that is called a SAR. And so if you attended this session last week that I did with the Kansas Board of Regents and about the Kansas FAFSA tracker, we talked about the difference between submitted and completed FAFSAs. And so in that case, submitted is all of the FAFSAs that your students have actually filled out and clicked the submit button on. For it to be considered complete, it has to have been accepted. And so the completed FAFSAs are a subset of all of the submitted ones. And so as the FAFSA is accepted as complete, then that student aid report will generate an EFC, or expected family contribution. And then the school is sent that same information in the form of an ISER, which is the Institutional Student Information Report. So it has all the same information that the student sees on the SAR, it's just in a little different layout. If there's some reason that their FAFSA cannot be fully processed and accepted, then it shows up as a rejected SAR. And so their EFC cannot be calculated, and then processing on their financial aid stops until the student resolves whatever has caused that SAR to reject. And we'll talk about on the next slide kind of what some of those common issues are. One very important piece that I don't know that a lot of students actually look at on the SAR, but is very important, is at the end, it will have the student aid report or SAR comments, and that's going to tell the students why their SAR was rejected, or if they were selected for verification, or other things that may affect their aid eligibility. So it's very important that they're actually reading those comments, because early on, they're going to know if they have issues or if they need some more information. Here is a sample of what they would see on part of their SAR. And where this blackout is, that's going to show their social security number and then their identifier, which is the first two letters of their last name. And then this bottom part is comment. So in this case, this student, their information could not be confirmed with the Social Security Administration. And so it had, their SAR had rejected. And then their parent had not signed the initial FAFSA or any corrections that had been submitted. So those are some of what they're going to see, and it will give them some direction on how to resolve that. These are the common reasons that we see a lot when a student has a rejected SAR. Most often is that a student or parent signature is missing. With how the student signs in to FAFSA.gov with their FSA ID to start the FAFSA process, it's getting to be less common that the student signature is missing, but there still is a frequency of parent signatures missing because they have to log in, or they have to be able to have that FSA ID for the parent to log in and then click the button that they accept and that they are signing that before it is submitted. And so even if the student and parent had both signed the initial FAFSA submission, but then maybe they had to make a correction, the student and the parent also have to sign the correction. So then the SAR could reject that second time just because maybe the parent didn't sign the correction, even though they had signed the first one. So like I said, that is definitely the most common thing that we see for rejected SAR. The FAFSA, when it is submitted, goes through several database matches, one of those being the Social Security Administration database. And so we see quite often that information listed for the student and or parent does not match what is in the Social Security Administration database. We see a lot of wrong date of birth, wrong Social Security numbers. I think that it's a lot of times maybe, you know, when I first saw it, I'm like, people don't know their birthday, but then I thought maybe parents are filling it out and they've got, you know, 2 kids, and or the students filling it out and they get their parents' date of birth wrong by a day. It happens, we can mistype things. So it is less likely to happen if they have created that FSA ID. We ask that they create that at least 3 days before they want to fill out their FAFSA, because that FSA ID goes through that database match with the Social Security Administration. So if it's been accepted, then that information that they're using on their FAFSA should be correct. So that would be how a way to make it less likely for a rejected SAR to happen with a wrong date of birth, Social Security number, name misspelling. Something else that we see is that students use their nickname instead of their legal name. The FAFSA is a legal document, so they do need to use their legal name that is on file with the Social Security Administration database. They also need to apply with the school with their legal name. Then they can choose a preferred name with the school, but if their legal name is Adam, and that is still what is on file with the Social Security Administration, but they go by Amanda, they need to fill out their school application with Adam, their FAFSA with Adam, but then with the school, they can say my preferred name is Amanda, and that can be updated with the school themselves, but the FAFSA would still have to be under their legal name. And if they've had a name change, so their name has legally been changed, they need to make sure and get that updated with the Social Security Administration database as soon as they can, so that it can match accurately. Otherwise, they'll have to wait until that name change is processed before they could get their FAFSA submitted through. We also sometimes see that there are data fields that are incorrect or incomplete on the FAFSA. Frequently, that is that they have not used the data retrieval tool, and when they were entering in the information, the taxes paid were listed as higher than the adjusted gross income. And then there is a possibility that they left their parent data off for one reason or another. So if they left the parent information off because they don't have contact with that parent, then they need to contact the financial aid office about a dependency override to see if they qualify for that. But in leaving that parent data off for any reason, if they are technically classified as a dependent student, that is going to reject their student aid report. So if your students have already filled out their FAFSA, let's say they did it last fall and they were dead set on one institution and that was the only place that they sent their FAFSA to, and now they've decided to attend a different school, they do not need to do a new FAFSA. They just need to make a correction to their existing FAFSA and add that school code. Make sure that the student and the parent both sign that correction. Otherwise, as we just got done talking about, their FAFSA will reject and they would have to go back in and do those signatures. Remember that you can send the FAFSA to up to 10 schools at one time. More than that can be listed, but it is only going to send it to the first 10. So if they had originally sent it to 10, but none of those 10 are their school of choice now, they're going to need to remove at least one of those they previously listed and add the school that they want to attend to. We do see this not quite often, but it does happen frequently that a student filled out their FAFSA the previous fall. They thought that they had included our school, but then they get here and we don't have their FAFSA on file, and it was because they just had never included us. So this may be something that you check with all of your seniors in the spring and say, hey, you know, let's make sure that you've got your FAFSA sent to all of the schools that you are still considering, or definitely the school that you have chosen to go to. And so then moving on to contacting the schools, it would be a great idea, and this could be something that you could help your students with, reaching out to the school or schools that they are considering to find out how is that institution going to notify students about outstanding financial aid requirements that they need to complete, and how will they be notified about their financial aid offer. Each school has a different process for that. And so reaching out to that institution, and so the student knows where they need to be looking for that information, how to access it. And it's something that they can go ahead and work on now to make sure that when August rolls around, they're ready and they've got everything good to go. And then while they're checking in with the school on that, find out, does the school need any other information from them at this time to process their FAFSA? You know, quite often if a student is selected for verification, that's going to be a lot of what's going to be needed at this point in time, but there may we may need proof of date of birth or proof of social security number or proof of high school completion. There's several other things that we could be requesting at that time. But and if the student is selected for verification, which 20 to 30% of all students are, kind of help guide them through getting those documents and figuring out what they need and getting them submitted to the school. The IRS, with some security and privacy updates, has created a new system, and they will be fully implementing it by this summer. And it's called ID.me, which is an IRS registration. So if a student did not use the data retrieval tool and needs to request a tax return transcript or a tax account transcript, record of account transcript, their wage and income transcript, or a verification of non-filing letter, in order to get these through the IRS website and receive them electronically, they'll have to be able to create this ID.me account. When this is fully implemented, in order to get the transcript online, it will require a copy of a photo ID, which could be driver's license, state ID, passport, or passport card. It will also require that the individual take a selfie with their smartphone or a camera on their computer and upload it so that they can compare that selfie with the photo documentation that has also been uploaded. So if you have students or parents that don't have these resources, especially the ability to take that selfie to get that uploaded, they may need some assistance in getting that done. Also, anyone under 18 cannot create the ID.me account. So you may have to advise them that if they are selected for verification, and let's say they turn 18 in June, they could set up that account online and request those documents then. However, if a student or parent is unable to create the ID.me account, they still have other options. For the tax return transcript or tax account transcript, they can choose the get transcript by mail or call the IRS hotline number and request that via the phone, and then it would be mailed to them. If they need a record of account transcript, a wage and income transcript, which would be a replacement for their W-2s if they have lost or misplaced those, or they need a verification of non-filing letter, those will all have to be requested via the form 4506T, which would then need to be faxed or mailed to the IRS. So this would be definitely something that you could be assisting your students with to make sure that they have time to get this information requested and sent to the school, or direct them to the financial aid office at the school for the financial aid office's assistance in walking them through this process and obtaining these documents. With that, and one last slide for me. Scholarships, there's probably potentially a lot of scholarship opportunities that they have missed out on if they have not started applying for scholarships yet. There's still going to be a lot of scholarships available that they could continue to apply for. So encourage them to be working on them now. I know they're going to be focused on finishing up their senior year and prom and graduation, but they still need to be working on these scholarship applications now so that they don't miss those opportunities. Look for institutional scholarships at the institution that they're planning on attending, departmental or activity scholarships at those institutions, scholarships in your local community, their parents' employers or their own employers if they offer scholarship opportunities. So with that, I will turn it over to Daisha to talk about our next few slides.
Yes, for sure. Okay, So continuing on from awesome Darcy, we're going to go ahead and go over to evaluating your aid offers. So it is important to evaluate them. We want to figure out, how we're going to pay for school. So first things first, we want to compare the net cost between the schools. So after all the grants and scholarships, any loans, after those are applied, the student, would want to figure out how they would pay the difference, how they're going to bridge the gap. Are there payment plans available? Are there any other scholarships or any other resources they can possibly get? So that would be a good place to start. Also, to bridge the gap, they might want to ask if there's a waiting list for any additional grants. There might be some funds that open up later. Here at JCCC, we do have some funds that kind of open up in the middle of the year. So you do want to kind of ask if there's any other outside opportunities that they could get, outside of what they see on their offer. Also, very important to know that the FAFSA doesn't always catch everything. It is just on a computer. It is a computer-generated program. So it's not going to be able to know all the family situations and, the different nuances that students and, families might have. So it is important to know, are there any special circumstances? Is the student homeless? Is there a, kind of dangerous relationship with parents? Or, you do know your student. So if you know that there's any special situations that's not reflected on the FAFSA, please do reach out to the financial aid office, and they will have a process on what we call professional judgment, where they're able to kind of evaluate and view what the best options for that student is. So definitely do reach out to the financial aid office. We're always our friends, so definitely do reach out to them. Lastly, can a student negotiate? Yes, this is probably more prevalent at private institutions than public institutions, but if there's an academic scholarship and they're like 0.01% away, from getting that, is there someone they can ask to possibly, still receive that funding? Or if there's any athletic scholarships, who can they talk to about possibly getting a scholarship or, getting their tapes reviewed or anything like that? Yeah, sounds good. On to the next slide. All right. Also equally as important, we're going to identify the requirements for each type of them. So we have scholarships, grants, loans, work study. We want to make sure we tie up all the loose ends to make sure we actually get the money. So for scholarships, you want to make sure if the organization needs transcripts or ACTs or anything like that, go ahead and send that over. If they need proof of enrollment, go ahead and send that over as well. Or anything that they might be asking for, make sure we tie up those loose ends, as students begin to graduate and check out for graduation and prom. We want to make sure we tie those up. For grants, could be the same thing. Make sure you want to contact, the financial aid office if there's anything that they're missing, outside of the Pell Grant, or to get the Pell Grant. We want to make sure that they're missing anything, not missing anything, so we can give them their monies. Loans, we want to make sure they're able to get loan entrance counseling and the master promissory note done. Just accepting the loans online is not enough. We want to make sure we finish all of the things. So definitely have them complete that. It's found on the studentaid.gov website. Really quick, really easy to complete. Have them go ahead and complete that so they can actually get their monies. If they're looking for Parent Plus loans, there is a little separate process for that. So definitely do make sure that the parent is completing all of their steps as well, or feel free to contact the financial aid office if there is any discrepancies or if you need help. Work study, of course, just like any other job, they want to make sure they apply to the jobs, go to the interview, turn in the paper to HR so they can get their work study funds. All right, since the students are checking out and graduating and getting done, we want to make sure we send their final transcripts. So definitely do have them send their final transcripts onto, the institution that they're going to make sure they seal the deal. They do need their final transcripts on file. As listed here, not providing them could definitely hold up federal aid. We do need proof that the student is a high school graduate to be federal aid eligible, whether that's equivalency with GED or, traditional high school. Go ahead and send that over to the school. Make sure they got it, have it received, so we can give them their monies and they can finally check out and be on their way to success.
All right, we'll go ahead. We're going to go ahead and take a short pause. There was one question in the chat box, but thank you, Linda, for answering that question. We do have a couple of questions that were asked in advance, and I'm going to go ahead and ask those to Darcy and Deja. So the first question is, what is the timeline you recommend to students who like to plan versus the students who do not?
That's a great question. And I would say really it kind of needs to be the same timeline because, and I realize that you've got some that don't like to plan and they're just, when in October, when the FAFSA opens, they are not thinking about college. They are not thinking about where they want to go. They're not thinking about how they're going to pay for college. And so they may not be as in big of a rush. But if you can explain to them, there are some limited grant funds. If you're Pell Grant eligible, you would get that. But there's some additional grants that have limited funding. And so the sooner they could get their FAFSA filled out, the quicker they're going to know if they're eligible for that and have a better opportunity at receiving some of those limited resource funds. Otherwise, as we talked about earlier, they might need to be put on a waiting list if they didn't get their FAFSA submitted early enough to be in that first round of awarding. Additionally, there are several scholarship applications that are going to require information that comes from the FAFSA. So if they don't have their FAFSA submitted, they are potentially going to miss out on getting those scholarships applied for. So they're missing out on even more free money opportunities. So if you can encourage them to get that done as quickly as possible, that would be great. But there's also, at the point that they do start thinking about it, the timeline would still kind of be the same. Fill out the FAFSA, apply for scholarships, check with the financial aid office, work through that process. The earlier they can get started on it, the less stressful it's going to be for them because they're going to be able to move through that process and have time to get it, as opposed to starting it in June or July and then panicking because they're then trying to get all of this documentation that may take a couple weeks for them to obtain anyway. Daisha, anything to add to that?
I don't necessarily have anything. It's always good if you plan. If you don't plan, you plan to fail. Everybody says that, and we know the IRS is mega slow. So if you do need anything, it is more important to get it done first. So yes, I second that.
Okay. We have one more question. Is there a general physical timeline you present to visual learners?
So right now, we don't have anything visual ready. However, for those of you who've been around for a little while, you may remember the junior senior calendar that CASPA used to put out. When we went to prior year and the FAFSA started opening in October, CASPA was no longer putting that out just because resources were shifting other places. However, our wonderful chair, Linda, who is on the call with us today from the Kansas Board of Regents, is working on an updated junior senior calendar. Linda, do you kind of want to talk about what that's going to look like and the timeline for that?
So our timeline is we're hoping to have that available sometime in March that you can give out to it'd be probably more for your junior students at that point, maybe even your sophomores to prepare them. It'll be a handout. It'll probably be either 2 pages if you choose to do it that way, or a front and back. One side will be for juniors, the other side will be for seniors. And hopefully it just kind of like today's presentation kind of gives them some guideline of things that they should be doing during certain times of the year. So we're very hopeful that that will help guide the students and keep them on track.
Perfect, thank you.
We do have one question. if families do not file a FAFSA, can that impact merit-based scholarships?
It should not, because those merit-based scholarships should just be based upon the merit, whether it be the academics or talents or other abilities. If there is a need component, a need-based component to that scholarship, then that would be where that would have an impact. But traditionally, no, a strictly merit-based scholarship would not be impacted if they did not fill out the FAFSA.
Thank you. Like we don't have any other questions, so we'll go ahead and just move forward.
All right, Daisha.
Hello again. So now we're going to jump into the Kansas Promise. We do have a slide here talking about Back to the Future. Your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one, period. I've never seen Back to the Future. I'm not going to lie. But this quote, okay, I like this. So I might have to watch it. But yeah, for sure. We're going to talk about some Kansas Promise. I'm sure we're also excited. Yes. Okay, A Future with Kansas Promise. So I'm going to go a little bit into the history, some of the details, eligibility, of course, income requirements, eligible programs, how to apply, and where to find the application. All right, so the history of Kansas Promise is a little brief. So it was created during 2021 Kansas legislative session. It was just 2021, so you know that was quick. Made to be implemented July 1 of 2021, so brand spanking new. It just hit the scene, but we let it work. So it's available at Kansas community colleges like JCCC, technical colleges, Washburn Institute of Technology, and certain private post-secondary education institutions. So definitely check with the school if you're not 100% sure if they offer Kansas Promise. So there are offered 2 select specified programs: information technology and security, mental and physical health care, advanced manufacturing and building trades, early childhood education and development, including elementary. And then there's also a 5th category that the institution chooses. So it's not on here, but it's up to the institution to choose what their 5th category is. So if you get the Kansas Promise money, it is used for tuition and required fees, books and supplies. So that pretty much covers the required materials for the program. So what is Kansas Promise? We've been hearing about it, but what is it? So Kansas Promise is a last dollar scholarship. So it pays for tuition, books, eligible course materials that aren't covered by other scholarships and grants. So that's kind of what last dollar means. It's pretty good to bridge the gap. So that's kind of what I think of it like. But there is a service obligation. So upon receiving Kansas Promise fundings, students must live and work in Kansas for 2 years after completing their program. So it is a service scholarship. If you fail to meet the service obligation, unfortunately, all the Kansas Promise monies that was a scholarship will turn into a Kansas Promise loan at the current plus loan interest rate of 6.28%. So I usually like to tell students, best case scenario, you graduate, you do your 2 years living and working in Kansas. It's a grant scholarship through and through. Worst case scenario is that you don't meet the service requirement and it becomes a loan at 6.28%. It's not retroactive. It's from when you break the contract and going forward. All right, so who is eligible? So Kansas Promise eligibility is mostly based on Kansas residency and a few other things. So you must be enrolled at least half-time, which is about 6+ credit hours in one of the qualified programs that I mentioned earlier. So the technology, healthcare, in any one of those, or the 5th category. And you must meet defined household requirements, and we'll go over that a little bit later. So you only need to meet one of the criteria. Either you have to graduate from a Kansas high school within the last 12 months, or be 21+ years old and have lived in Kansas at least 3 consecutive years, from when you filled out the application. Or you can be a dependent child of a military service member permanently stationed in another state and a high school graduate from any out-of-state secondary school within the last 12 months. All right, so here are the income requirements. Pretty much for a household of 1 or 2, the maximum you can have, well, the maximum adjusted gross income is $100,000, and then it kind of goes up from there. And we get this information directly from the FAFSA. So the FAFSA does have to be completed. We'll go into that a little bit later, but we'll pull the adjusted gross income off of the FAFSA and the household size to determine eligibility. All right, so here are some Promise eligible program examples. So each school will have their own Kansas Promise eligible programs. Here at JCCC, we have over 40 of them, so it's a lot of them. So I just touched on a few. For art and design, we have interior design, we have construction management. For education, here at JCCC, we have early childhood education, but elementary education also counts as well. For computers, we have info systems. I thought game development was pretty cool, but we do have that here, so that also counts. Cybersecurity, of course, we have the health majors, dental hygiene, nursing, EMS, CNA, CMA. I know the health fields are popping, so we definitely got you there. Industrial technology, we have electrical tech, we have HVAC, metal fabrication, and here at JCCC, our 5th area is American Sign Language, but at like Butler Community College, they have fire science, and at Cloud Community College, I know they have agriculture. So definitely do check with your school to see what their 5th area is, if your student is eligible, is looking at something else that's outside of the Big 4 categories that are listed there. All right, so how do we apply? How do students apply? So complete the application for admissions for the school that you're looking for. You do also want to complete the FAFSA. That is a requirement for, to be eligible for Kansas Promise funds. Of course, complete the school scholarship application. We want to make sure the students get as much free money, no strings attached, as they can. So definitely do go ahead and fill out the school's application. Then you want to complete the Kansas Promise application. So some schools have it available online, or you can just mail it into the institution, and I'll kind of show you where you can get that from as well. Then you will want to meet with their financial aid office. Here at JCCC, you meet with a coordinator like me, and we talk about Kansas Promise. I let you know the implications, how Kansas Promise Scholarship can possibly turn to Kansas Promise Loan, and to kind of help you pick the best option for, the student's future. And then also you want to make sure you're in the right program, taking the right classes. So definitely have them meet with their advisor or their counselor at their college to make sure they're taking the right stuff. All right, where to find the application? So some schools have electronic applications, and it's generally available in the school scholarship portal. So if you're a Kansas resident and if you're fully admitted and you have a FAFSA on file, you're able to see the application on, the virtual portal. Here at JCCC, that's what we have. If you're a Kansas resident, fully admitted, FAFSA on file, boop, you can apply for Kansas Promise. We also accept paper applications. I know everyone accepts those as well. So there's 2 places where you can get them. The links are on the screen. You're able to grab them from the Kansas Board of Regents, or KBOR, or you're able to grab them from KACCT and just submit those to the school. So you can send them via mail. Here at JCCC, we also accept them via email as well. If you just email them to our office, we'll accept them.
Deja, we do have one question that was asked in advance.
Yes.
Is it likely that each community college technical schools will change what programs are covered year to year for the Kansas Promise Act?
Most likely no, because we get those directly from the Kansas Board of Regents. They let us know which programs are eligible. Most likely those are going to stay the same. The only one I can imagine changing is probably the 5th area, but that the specific schools get to pick, but I doubt that, we would change them. At least at JCCC, we don't have any talk of changing the 5th area or anything like that. So most likely they'll just stay the same.
Thank you. And it looks like we don't have any questions that were asked in the chat, so we'll go ahead and move forward.
All right, sounds good.
We do have a couple of other individuals on with us today that work at other technical colleges in Kansas. So Laura and Rachel, do either of you in your work through the technical colleges want to add anything about the Promise Act or share like your special programs or anything to that effect?
At WSU Tech, ours is logistics and supply chain management, but I'm not sure of, I don't really have anything else to add that we haven't already said.
I was going to mention that in the law, there's actually, once you choose that fifth area, you basically have locked that in for 3 years. So if a school has a fifth area determined, it'll be the same area probably for the next 2 years per the law.
Before we move forward, we do have a couple more questions that popped in the chat. So I'll go ahead and ask it. Let me pull that up real quick so I can ask Deja. How do we know when the funds will run out?
I would probably say that we would let you know, but I know here at JCCC, we are nowhere near running out. So that's most likely not something that you should have to worry about. But if you are concerned, definitely do ask. But I don't foresee that.
Okay. Is there a deadline as well for the Promise Act?
There is not a deadline. It's rolling. So whenever we get the application in is when we process it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. No more questions. So we'll go ahead and move forward.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Sealy. So another quote from Back to the Future, and Daisha, you definitely need to see this movie. But as I was putting together this section, I really could not think of a more appropriate quote. So I was really glad that we were using this movie theme. So I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet, but your kids are going to love it. And we are talking about FAFSA simplification. And I think by the time we get to the end of this, y'all are going to have a little bit more insight as to that. So there's going to be some significant changes on the horizon to the FAFSA in order to simplify the FAFSA. Keep in mind that simple doesn't always mean easy, but in the end, this simplification is going to be great. I think it's really going to help you help your students and help them make more educated decisions, especially early on. So some of these conversations that you have with your students are going to be easier with this, I believe. But in this section, I'm going to talk about the Future Act, the FAFSA Simplification Act, the implementation timeline of these changes, some removal and addition of questions to the FAFSA. The EFC is now going to become the SAI, so we'll talk about what that all means. The changes in determining Pell eligibility, and then even more changes. So let's get started into this. The Future Act was passed on December 19th of 2019, and the big part of the Future Act that it impacted financial aid was for an automatic data exchange from the IRS to the FAFSA. We know there have been some pain points with getting the out to the IRS website and getting it to transfer back in, making sure that the taxpayers' information is entered exactly correct on the IRS website to confirm that that's their information before it's pulled back to the FAFSA. So the data retrieval tool will be going away, and it is becoming the Future Act Direct Data Exchange, or FADDX, or I like to come up with other sayings for the acronyms, so I'm just going to start calling FADEX. And this data exchange is also going to allow when someone is calculating and recertifying their income-driven repayment plans, this data exchange will be able to be used for that. And then also if someone is receiving Social Security disability benefits because of a total and permanent disability discharge, this data exchange from the IRS can help confirm the income for those individuals to federal student aid in order to help for their loan discharge. But primarily where you're going to see it is this direct data exchange on the FAFSA. There is a lot of complexities in getting this implemented, and it is to be implemented by the 24-25 aid year. And a lot of that comes from the privacy of federal tax information and in regards to consent and confidentiality of sharing that information. So the IRS has to make sure that this data exchange is completely secure in sending this information over to federal student aid for the FAFSA form. So there's that piece that happened in 2019, and they've been in the process of working together to get that implemented. And then on December 27th of 2020, the Consolidated Appropriations Act was passed. And there was a lot of information that was passed in that act, part of that being the FAFSA Simplification Act. And this is going to create significant changes to the FAFSA process, to the form itself, how students will complete the form, and their eligibility calculation for aid. So when the FAFSA Simplification Act was passed, it was Congress originally said that all of these changes had to be implemented going into the 2023-2024 aid year or FAFSA year. However, knowing that they were having to implement the direct data exchange with the IRS, plus the complexities of getting all of these changes made, they asked Congress, can we push this back to 24-25 so we can just implement everything at one time instead of, kind of doing piecemeal here and there? And that was approved. However, some of the changes that were made, the Department of Education had the option for early implementation. And so two of those items were waiving the selective service requirement for anyone who was born male to register for selective service at the age of 18 and before 26. And they had to do that in order to be eligible for Title IV aid. And then also, if an individual received a drug conviction while receiving federal financial aid, they could lose their eligibility for a certain time frame. So those two requirements no longer impact students. Those are no longer required. But because the FAFSA was already rolled out for 21-22 at the time that they decided to early implement that, those questions are still on the FAFSA. If a student is impacted by one of those, the comments on their student aid report are still going to indicate that they need to do that, but they don't. So the aid offices were advised that we needed to waive the selective service registration requirement and the drug conviction requirement and not hold a student liable for those and hold up their financial aid if they weren't meeting one of those requirements. So those are no longer required. We were able to waive all of that. And you'll see at the top of these boxes, I have class of. So like this 21-22, that really first impacted your senior class of 2021. So your senior class of 2022, these current seniors that you're working with, the selective service and drug conviction questions that I just referenced are still on the FAFSA for 22-23, because of when the FAFSA form is created, they still didn't have time to remove those questions. However, the comment text on the student aid report output has been changed. And so the students can see that they are no longer liable for making sure that that's not impacting them. They're not saying, you know, hey, you have this requirement that you haven't met. So that comment text has been changed so that the students can see that that's not an issue for them anymore. So for your senior class of 2023, the ones that start next fall, so the FAFSA that opens on October 1st of this year, the selective service registration requirement and the option to register for the selective service registration will be removed. The drug conviction questions will be removed from the FAFSA, so none of those will even show up on there anymore. And then the other change that's coming on this upcoming FAFSA is that those 3 questions that ask about homeless youth, identify in the dependency questions, those questions will become renewal eligible. So if you had someone from the class of 22 that had filled out the 22-23 FAFSA that had indicated that they were a homeless youth or met that definition, when they go to fill out their FAFSA for 2023-2024, that question is going to automatically be filled in for them with their answer from the previous year. And then they just need to make sure that that is still accurate. And if not, then they'll need to make a change. But instead of them having to read through it and select that again, it will just automatically assume that they have the same situation. And then if they don't, they need to make that change on the FAFSA. So moving into the 2024-2025 year, so your senior class of 2024 will be the first class that you'll be, most of you will be working with directly. You will see the full implementation of all Future Act and FAFSA Simplification Act changes. So from this point forward, what I'm talking about is going to be referring to what will happen upon that full implementation in 24-25. So these changes you are not going to see until the start of the 2024-2025 aid year. The FAFSA Simplification Act is very prescriptive on what can be asked on the FAFSA. And so it is causing some questions to be removed if the data is no longer required or if it can be obtained somewhere else. And the goal for Congress when they wrote this was to get as much of the information that can be pulled over from the IRS or other databases that information already exists into the FAFSA. And so that's definitely going to change how that FAFSA form looks and how the students are filling it out. There are a few new questions that are going to be added. There will be a race and ethnicity question, as well as a gender identity question. These 2 questions are not impacting a student's eligibility for federal financial aid. The sole reason that these questions are being added is for disaggregated data so that they can track, FAFSA completion and look at, who's receiving aid in these different categories. So it is in no means impacting if a student's getting financial aid or how much financial aid they're getting. It is simply for some data statistics down the road. And then for an independent student, currently they would just mark that they were married, but now moving forward, someone who qualifies as an independent student because they are married, they will have to list their spouse's name and their spouse's social security number on the FAFSA. Currently, as you're likely aware, the FAFSA, all of the data that you put on the FAFSA is used to calculate an expected family contribution, or EFC. So the EFC is going away. which is probably a good thing because it was kind of a misnomer that, people hear expected family contribution and they think, what do you mean I have to walk in with $6,000 to pay for school right now? I don't have that kind of money. So instead, the FAFSA data is going to be used to calculate a student aid index, or SAI. And the SAI represents the resources that a family has to support the student's education. So really, it's kind of the same as the EFC. It's calculated a little differently, and it's obviously named something else, but it is hopefully being shown as more of that index. And there's some other different ways that it's going to be used. Again, I mentioned earlier, I like to create other nicknames on those acronyms. So I've decided that the SAI, I'm just going to start calling the SAI. And this is going to go into effect beginning with the 2024-2025 year. And the one thing that does remain the same for the SAI as to what the EFC was, is this SAI is still used to determine a student's financial need for need-based aid. All right, so some notes about the SAI calculation. The income is now mostly going to be determined by that FADDX transfer. So that direct data exchange that's coming over from the IRS is how they're going to obtain almost all of the income information. There will be a considerable reduction in what counts as untaxed income because it is going to be limited to what appears on the tax return. Child support received will be counted in with the assets. The assets will mostly remain the same that have to be reported. However, starting with this full implementation in 24-25, family farms, the value of family farms and small businesses will now be required to be reported as assets. Another big change is that the number in college is not going to be used in the SAI calculation anymore. So currently, if the parents had 2 in college, then the parental part of the EFC would be divided in 2. That is no longer going to be the case. So whatever the student aid index is determined for the parent will be the same regardless of whether they have 1 or 4 children in college at one time. Currently, the EFC, you can't go lower than 0. With the SAI, it can now be a negative number down to negative 1,500. And those who are not required to file a tax return in the base tax year will get an auto negative 1,500 SAI. So the base tax year is the tax year that the FAFSA is requesting for that year to be completed. And so if they were not required to file taxes during that year, then they would have an automatic negative 1,500 SAI. Okay. So here's a little bit of fun. The determining Pell eligibility is going to change a little bit. This is going to be where it's going to be easier for you to help your students kind of identify the Pell amount that they might be eligible, or if they're going to be eligible for Pell prior to them filling out their FAFSA. You know, for years, we've had parents call or students call and say, well, my parents make this amount of money. How much am I going to get in financial aid? Or am I going to qualify for a Pell Grant? Well, there were so many other data points that went into that EFC calculation that we could determine that just based upon a parent's income. So that's going to be changing coming in 24-25. So there's going to be a max Pell amount, and those who are eligible for max Pell, which we'll get to on this second block, those max Pell are going to have an auto zero SAI. So if they qualify for max Pell, then their SAI is going to automatically just be 0 without doing the calculation. Now, if doing the calculation to determine the SAI, it's determined that the SAI is actually negative, then that negative number would remain their index number instead of the 0. I know that takes a little bit to get your head wrapped around. So those that will qualify for maximum Pell Grant amount are non-tax filers, so those that were not required to file a tax return in that base year. And again, remember, they're going to have an automatic negative 1,500 SAI. Single parent filers, so those parents of dependent students who are classified as single parents, and there's a new definition for single parents that we'll get to. So if their AGI is greater than 0, but less than or equal to 225% of the poverty line, then they would automatically qualify for a maximum Pell Grant amount. Or if you have an independent student who is not a single parent, or a parent of a dependent student, and their AGI is greater than 0, but less than or equal to 170% of the poverty line, they also would qualify for the maximum Pell Grant amount. There will also be a minimum Pell Grant amount, which is the max 10% of whatever Congress determines in the appropriations that year of what the maximum Pell amount is. And then the Pell amount for those not eligible for max Pell, so if they don't qualify for max Pell, they could still get a Pell amount, but the amount that they would get would be determined on whatever the dollar amount of the max Pell is minus their SAI. But then if that number becomes lower than a minimum Pell, then they wouldn't get Pell Grant at all. So let me give you some specifics, because I know that was a lot of information and kind of confusing. So hopefully putting some numbers to this would kind of help explain that. So let's say that for that year, the maximum Pell Grant amount that a student could receive is $6,000. So the second block here, if they met any of those 3 criteria, they would automatically qualify for $6,000 in Pell Grant for that year. Moving to the second block, 10% of $6,000 would be $600. So the minimum Pell Grant amount that any student could receive would be $600 for the year. And so if they didn't meet any of the 3 criteria under the max Pell eligibility box, they could still receive a Pell Grant. However, that amount would be calculated by taking the max Pell amount. So in my example, $6,000, subtracting what their SAI is, and then rounding that to the nearest $5, and that's going to be their Pell Grant amount. So if their the maximum Pell Grant amount is $6,000, the calculation to determine what their student aid index is determines that their student aid index is 2,000. Then we take the 6,000 minus their 2,000 SAI, and that means that their Pell Grant for the year would be $4,000. If their SAI is negative, then that's actually would then count as 0. So let's say that the maximum Pell Grant amount is $600. Their actual student aid index is a negative 200. We wouldn't take the 6,000 minus negative 200. We would just take 6,000 minus 0. So they would still have that maximum Pell amount of $6,000. But let's say that their SAI is 5,500. So 6,000 minus 5,500 is 500. that is less than the minimum Pell amount, so they would not be eligible for a Pell Grant. Clear as mud? All right, so there's all of that. However, so even if they don't qualify based upon anything I mentioned on the previous slide, there is a, they could still qualify for minimum Pell amount. So in my example, they still could qualify for that $600 if they met one of the criteria here. So if they were a dependent student and they had a single parent whose AGI is less than or equal to 325% of the poverty line, they could qualify for that minimum Pell amount of $600 for the year. Or if their parent is not a single parent and their AGI is less than or equal to 275% of the poverty line, they could also qualify for that $600 for the year in Pell. For independent students, if that independent student is a single parent and their AGI is less than or equal to 400% of the poverty line, if that independent student is a parent, but they're not a single parent, then their AGI has to be less than or equal to 350% of the poverty line. If this independent student is not a parent at all, then their AGI has to be less than or equal to 275% of the poverty line. So moving on to this slide, the poverty guidelines are out on, you can see the website that I listed below this chart. This is where you can find the poverty guidelines. So for this is what the poverty guidelines are for this current year for the 48 United States. So Hawaii and Alaska are not included in this, but DC is. And then, so this website has this chart. It also has the separate charts for Alaska and for DC. But then there's also a link on this webpage that will pop up a graph that shows you what these percentages are. So you don't have to take this poverty, you know, for a family size of 3, you don't have to take the poverty guideline of 23,000 and multiply it by 275,000 or 275%, because they have a chart out there that's already done for you, which is fabulous. So that's going to also help be able to look at that. So with the data that I had, and I don't recall where I put that chart out. I was going to show it up on the screen and show it to you guys, but you can also go to the website and download it. So for a dependent student with a family size of 3, and the family does not have a single parent by the definition of single parent, for them to qualify for a maximum Pell amount, they would have to be, their AGI would have to be less than or equal to 175% of the poverty line. So that would mean that in order to qualify for a max Pell, the parent's AGI would have to be less than or equal to $40,303 for that base tax year. All right, so if that wasn't enough information for you, there's still a few more changes that are coming with this. So the definition of a single parent is clearly defined in what can be considered a single parent. So for a parent of a dependent student, or for a student who qualifies as an independent who is a parent themselves, if in the base tax year they were either head of household as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, a surviving spouse as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, or eligible for the earned income credit, then that is what meets that definition of them actually being considered a single parent for the purpose of the FAFSA and for determining these Pell Grant amounts. And this link that I have in the box here will take you to what that code is that defines head of household and the surviving spouse. Another change is that so those that file a foreign tax return will still not be able to use the direct data exchange, so they will have to manually enter in their information. However, now any foreign earned income will be counted as untaxed income starting in 24-25 and moving forward. A few more changes. You know, we always have the question, which parent's information should I use on the FAFSA? And most of the time that's just been the residential parent if the parents are divorced or separated. However, that is changing, and it is clearly defined that if the parents are divorced or separated, the parent that is to be used must be the parent who is providing more support to the student, regardless of whether they are the residential parent or not. And then who is a dependent of the parent is also clearly defined, that when you're calculating the number of dependents that the parent or parents have, so those parents are listed on the FAFSA, the number of dependents will be the student plus those individuals who live with the parents and receive more than half of their support from the parent. And then family size. So you've heard us in the past refer to it as household size. It's now changing to family size. And that family size is determined by the Internal Revenue Code definition of dependent under Section 152, which the link above that box will take you to that definition, or those who qualify for the child tax credit under Section 24, and the link below will take you to that definition. We are not tax professionals, so I cannot advise you on the interpretation of those definitions, especially at this point in time. And then one last thing is, if a student cannot provide parental information, you'll remember me saying at the very beginning, maybe remember me saying at the very beginning that let's say that they don't have contact with their parents, and so they can't get that information. They were technically a dependent student, but they had to leave their parents' information off. That would reject their student aid report. And then they would have to work with the school for a dependency override. There wouldn't be an EFC calculated until that got resolved by the aid office. So now, if an otherwise dependent student does not provide a parent's information because they don't have access to it, now their FAFSA will be fully processed with a provisional independent student status. So it's going to assume that they are an independent student, and it will go ahead and calculate an SAI for them and estimate a Pell Grant amount. However, they still are going to need to work with the school, because the school will still need to determine if the student qualifies for dependency override and make that update on the FAFSA so it can be fully processed and move them from a provisional independent student to an independent student status. Okay.
Darcy, can we answer a question?
Absolutely.
Okay. How exactly is it determined who is providing more support? So this is the parent question.
Mm-hmm.
Who do we contact is a better way to phrase it. So do we have reference to determine those financial variables?
That right now is not clearly defined. So I think it still needs to be up to the family to look at the finances and say, you know, I'm buying, I'm spending this much on the child. I am paying for all of their health care, which equals this dollar amount. I'm paying for all their sports activities. I'm buying their food. It's really going to be up to the family to determine which parent is providing more of that financial support, whether it be in the form of them actually buying that stuff, paying for those things, providing the child support for those things to be paid for. So that's not been clearly defined, and it's also not been clearly defined as the definitive timeline of when you look at. So was it in the previous 12 months? And so it's going to be up to the family still to decide this is the parent that is providing more of the financial support.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and move forward.
Okay. That was all that I had on FAFSA simplification. So please feel free to enter any additional questions in there, and know that Federal Student Aid is still working on getting their systems updated and implementing this. They're still releasing information on this, and there was even more that was passed in that FAFSA Simplification Act. So this was just kind of the pieces that I thought were critical for you all to know right now, to kind of start thinking about how you can change those conversations with your students moving forward. So know that more information will be coming out, and as it gets closer, we will have more detailed information. A reminder that we have one last session in this year's outreach training series, and it's going to be focusing on planning for college finances. It is March 2nd from 9:30 to 11. And you can still register for that out on the counselor training webpage on CASPA.org.
I have one more thing to mention. I am dropping the link to the evaluation for today's presentation. We would really appreciate everybody's feedback. We're going to stick around. If you guys have some questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat, and I'll go ahead and ask Stacia and Darcy.